They sent him as a prisoner to the stars. Marcus Cole remembered the exact moment his life ended. And it was not when the judges read his sentence. And it was not when they put the chains on his wrists. It was the moment he saw Earth shrinking in the viewport of the prison transport, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just another dot among millions of stars. He'd been a soldier for 15 years. A sergeant who led men through fire and brought them home alive. And his record was perfect until the day it was not. Until the day his commanding officer ordered him to fire on unarmed civilians during the Kepler colony riots. And Marcus had looked at those people, families with children hiding behind barricades made of furniture and broken dreams. And he had lowered his weapon and told his men to do the same. They called it mutiny. They called it treason. They called it a crime against the United Terran Authority. But Marcus knew what it really was. It was the only choice he could live with. And now he would die for it. The prison transport was called the Gehenna's Wake, a fitting name for a ship carrying 400 souls to hell. And the journey took 3 months through the cold, dark spaces between stars. 3 months of recycled air and recycled water and recycled hope until there was nothing left but the hollow shells of men who had once been human. Marcus kept to himself during the voyage, watching and listening and learning the way a soldier learns enemy territory before a mission. And he learned that the other prisoners were not so different from him. Some were murderers and some were thieves, but most were simply people who had made powerful enemies or stood in the way of powerful interests. And the Authority had found reasons to send them all to the same place. Nexer V appeared in the viewport on the 92nd day. A gray moon orbiting a gas giant so massive it filled half the sky with swirling bands of orange and red. And the prisoners pressed against the windows to see their new home, their new grave. The place where humans went to be forgotten. The Nexari Collective controlled this region of space. A confederation of 7 alien species who had been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves. And they had agreed to take Earth's prisoners in exchange for the rare minerals found deep beneath the moon's surface. Minerals that human hands would dig from the rock until those hands could dig no more. The landing was rough and the guards were rougher. Tall creatures called Kethrai, with bodies covered in plates of chitin-like living armor, and eyes that held no warmth and no mercy. And they herded the prisoners off the ship with electric prods and guttural commands in a language that sounded like stones. Grinding together, Marcus received his number that first day. Prisoner 7749, burned into a metal tag that hung around his neck. And he received his assignment to Mining Shaft 12. And he received his first beating when he looked a guard in the eye for too long. The mining complex was vast. A maze of tunnels and barracks and processing plants that stretched for miles beneath the moon's surface. And the air smelled of dust and sweat and something chemical that made the throat burn. And the lights were always dim because the Kethrai could see in darkness and did not care if the humans could not. Marcus learned the rules quickly because learning slowly meant dying. And the rules were simple enough. Work until the shift ended. Eat what they gave you. Sleep when they allowed it. And never ever fight back no matter what they did to you, because fighting back meant the pits. And the pits meant death. He learned that the average human survived 14 months on Nexer 7. Some lasted longer, and some lasted only days. But 14 months was the number the veterans whispered when the guards were not listening. 14 months until the dust filled your lungs or the tunnels collapsed on your head or the guards decided you were more entertaining dead than alive. The work was brutal. Swinging picks at rock that seemed harder than anything on Earth. Loading carts with ore that weighed more than a man could carry. But they carried it anyway because the alternative was worse. Breathing air that tasted like poison and drinking water that tasted like metal. And at the end of each shift, Marcus could barely lift his arms, but he lifted them anyway, because stopping meant dying. He watched the other prisoners in those first weeks, learning who could be trusted and who could not. learning the small economies of survival that existed in every prison from Earth to the edge of the galaxy. And he saw men who had given up, and men who were holding on, and men who had found reasons to keep breathing, even in a place designed to take that reason away. There was a boy named Jin who reminded Marcus of a private he had once served with. Too young to be here, and too scared to hide it. And Marcus found himself teaching the boy how to swing a pick without destroying his shoulders, how to pace himself through a 12-hour shift, how to find the small moments of rest that the guards did not notice. There was an old man named Torres who had been a doctor before whatever crime had sent him here. And Torres knew which coughs meant death was coming, and which ones meant you might survive another day. And he shared his knowledge freely, even though knowledge was the only currency he had left. There was a woman named Sarah who organized the food distribution in their barracks, making sure everyone got their share, even when the rations were cut. And she did this not because anyone asked her to, but because someone had to, and she had decided it would be her. Marcus watched all of them, and he saw something he had not expected to find in this place. He saw humanity refusing to die, even as everything tried to kill it. He saw people caring for each other when caring cost them everything. And he felt something stir in his chest that he thought the authority had killed when they put him in chains. 6 months passed and Marcus was still alive, which surprised him because he had stopped expecting to survive after the first week. And somewhere along the way he had stopped just surviving and started leading again. Not because he wanted to, but because people kept coming to him with problems and he kept solving them. And the other prisoners started calling him Sarge when the guards could not hear. He did not know that he was being watched. He did not know that eyes from a species older than humanity had noticed him in the darkness of the mines. He did not know that his small acts of kindness and quiet strength had caught the attention of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall and thought she had seen everything there was to see. All he knew was that another day had ended and he was still breathing, and somewhere on the other side of the stars there was a planet called Earth that he would never see again. And that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all he had. They sent him as a prisoner to the stars. The Valori had no name that human tongues could speak. Her true name was a symphony of light and memory that took 3 days to fully express. But the prisoners who saw her pass through the mining tunnels called her the Watcher, and the name was more accurate than they knew. She had lived for 4,000 years, and she would live for 4,000 more if the universe was kind. And in all that time, she had seen empires crumble and species vanish and stars go dark. And she had recorded it all, because that was what the Valori did. They witnessed and they remembered, and they made sure that nothing was ever truly forgotten. Her body was not like the bodies of other species. She was made of something that looked like frozen starlight given form, with skin that shifted through colors depending on her mood and eyes that held depths like looking into the heart of a galaxy. And she moved with a grace that made other beings feel clumsy just by watching her. And she was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are. Beautiful. The collective had sent her to Nexus 7 to document the human labor program, a minor assignment that most Valori would have found beneath them. But she had accepted because she was curious about these strange creatures from the distant arm of the galaxy. These beings who had only discovered faster-than-light travel a few centuries ago and already acted like they owned the stars. She expected to find animals. Clever animals perhaps, but animals nonetheless. Digging in the dirt and dying in the dark and providing nothing worthy of her attention. And she expected to complete her documentation in a few weeks and move on to more interesting subjects. She did not expect Marcus Cole. The first time she saw him was in Mining Shaft 12, observing from an elevated walkway where she could watch without being noticed. And at first he seemed like any other human, covered in dust and sweat and working with the mindless rhythm of the exhausted. But then something happened that made her stop and truly look. A younger prisoner collapsed near the end of the shift, his body simply giving out after too many hours of too much labor. And the guards moved toward him with their prods ready, because a prisoner who could not work was a prisoner who needed motivation. But before they could reach the boy, the human called Marcus was there. He did not fight the guards, because fighting meant death. But he positioned himself between them and the fallen prisoner, and he spoke to them in their own language, badly accented but understandable. And he told them that the boy would be back on his feet in an hour if they let him rest, but would be useless for days if they injured him now. And he spoke not with fear, but with the calm logic of someone presenting a business proposal. The guards hesitated because his argument made sense, and because there was something in his eyes that gave them pause. Something that suggested hurting this human might cost more than it was worth. And after a moment they moved on, and the boy was allowed to rest, and Marcus helped him to his feet. When the shift finally ended, the watcher observed this and found it interesting. She returned to the mines. The next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, always watching the human called Marcus. And the more she watched, the more her interest grew, because he was not behaving the way prisoners were supposed to behave. When the food rations were cut by a third because of some administrative decision made by beings who had never known hunger, Marcus created a system where those who could afford to share gave a little to those who could not. And he did this so quietly that the guards never noticed, and the sharing continued for weeks, until the rations were restored when a cave-in trapped 12 prisoners in a side tunnel. It was Marcus who organized the rescue, while the guards stood by and did nothing, directing the digging and shoring up the walls and pulling bodies from the rubble. And when they found survivors, he was the first one into the gap, even though the rocks were still shifting, and another collapse could have killed him when fights broke out in the barracks, as they always did in places where desperate people were packed together with nothing to lose. Marcus did not win them with violence, but with words, and sometimes with humor, and sometimes with nothing more than standing between two angry men and refusing to move. Until they calmed down, the watcher had seen many species in her long life. She had seen warriors and conquerors and tyrants and saints, but she had never seen anything quite like this human who led without commanding and inspired, without demanding, and somehow made the people around him believe they could survive when everything told them they could not. She began to read the human historical archives that the collective maintained, looking for context that might explain what she was observing. And she found stories of soldiers and leaders and ordinary people who had done extraordinary things not for glory or power, but simply because someone had to. And she began to understand that this behavior was not unique to Marcus Cole, but was something woven into the fabric of humanity itself. The other species of the collective had noticed humans because they were useful, strong enough to work, and numerous enough to be expendable, and clever enough to follow instructions. But none of them had looked deeper. None of them had asked what made these creatures tick, what drove them, what they were capable of. When pushed to the edge, the watcher was beginning to suspect that the collective had made a mistake in underestimating these beings from the distant arm of the galaxy. She found herself visiting the mines more and more often, always watching, always recording. And she told herself it was professional interest, academic curiosity, the natural fascination of an observer who had found something worth observing. But there was something else growing in her ancient heart, something she had not felt in centuries. Something that might have been called connection if she had been willing to name it 6 months after her arrival on Nexus 7. The watcher made a decision that would change everything. She decided to speak to him. The opportunity came after a particularly brutal shift when Marcus sat alone in a corner of the barracks, too tired to eat and too stubborn to sleep. and she approached him without guards or ceremony or any of the protocols that were supposed to govern interactions between observers and subjects. He looked up at her with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity and something that might have been recognition, as if he had known she was watching all along and had been waiting for her to make her move. And she asked him a question that had been burning in her mind since the first day she saw him lift a fallen boy from the dust. She asked him why he cared, why he helped people who could give him nothing in return, why he risked himself for strangers, why he kept fighting for others when his own survival was far from certain. His answer was simple, and it changed everything she thought she knew about humanity. He said that kindness was not a transaction. It was a choice, and that choosing to be kind in a place that rewarded cruelty was the only way to stay human. And that staying human was the only thing worth fighting for. Watcher recorded his words and stored them in her perfect memory where they would remain for thousands of years. And she felt something shift inside her, some barrier falling that she had not even known was there. For the first time in 4,000 years, she was not just watching, she was involved. They sent him as a prisoner to the stars. Overseer Threlkak had ruled Mineshaft 12 for 30 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered a human he could not break. They all broke eventually, through pain or exhaustion or despair. It was simply a matter of finding the right pressure point and applying enough force. But the one called Marcus Cole was proving difficult, and Threlkak did not like difficult. He had noticed the Watcher's interest in the human, and at first he had found it amusing. The ancient Valori, fascinated by a primitive creature like a scientist studying insects. But as the weeks passed and her visits continued, his amusement turned to irritation. The prisoners had begun to notice, and they were talking, whispering that one of them had caught the attention of something powerful. And whispers were dangerous in a place where hope was the most deadly weapon. Threlkak decided that Marcus Cole needed to die. Not quickly in the mines where it might look like an accident, but publicly in a way that would remind everyone, humans and aliens alike, exactly where the power in this place resided. The fighting pits of Nexer 7 were legendary throughout the collective. An arena carved from solid rock where prisoners fought for the entertainment of their masters. And survival was possible, but not expected. And death came in forms that the spectators found creative, and the participants found horrifying. Marcus was pulled from his barracks in the middle of the night cycle, without warning or explanation. Dragged through corridors he had never seen by guards who laughed at questions he did not bother asking. And when they threw him into a holding cell beneath the arena, he understood immediately what was happening. Had known this was coming. Sooner or later, every prisoner who stood out was sent to the pits. It was how the system maintained itself, by destroying anyone who might become a symbol of resistance. And Marcus had become exactly that without ever intending. The Watcher learned of his selection 3 hours before the fight was scheduled to begin, and she felt something she had not felt in centuries. Something cold and sharp that cut through her ancient calm like a blade through silk. And she recognized it finally as fear, not for herself, but for someone else. And that was more terrifying than anything she had witnessed in 4,000 years. She could not interfere directly. The laws of her people were clear on that point. Observers did not participate. They only recorded. But she could watch. And so she went to the arena and took her place in the viewing gallery and waited for what was coming. The arena was packed with spectators from a dozen species, all of them eager to see blood spilled and suffering displayed. And the noise they made was like a physical force pressing down on everything below. And in the center of it all was a circle of sand surrounded by walls too high to climb and gates that led to places no one wanted to go. Marcus was thrown into the arena with nothing but a rusted blade and the clothes on his back. And across from him, one of the gates opened and something emerged that made the crowd roar with anticipation. A Varric. six-limbed and massive and built entirely for killing, with claws that could tear through metal and a hide that could stop most weapons and a brain that knew only hunger and the joy of the hunt. And it had been starved for 3 days specifically for this moment. Marcus did not panic. He had faced death before, and he knew that panic was the fastest way to find it. And instead, he watched the creature as it entered the arena, studying the way it moved, the way it held its weight, the way its eyes tracked him across the sand. The Vorik charged, and Marcus moved. Not away, but sideways in an angle the creature did not expect. And his blade found a gap in its armor where the limbs joined the body. And the creature screamed and turned and charged again. They fought for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The human dancing around the monster, taking small cuts where he could and avoiding the killing strikes that came closer and closer each time. And the crowd grew quiet because this was not how humans were supposed to die. They were supposed to die screaming and begging and providing entertainment. Not fighting like this, not lasting like this. When the Vorik finally fell, its throat opened by a strike that required more courage than skill. The arena was silent for a long moment before the cheering began. But it was a different kind of cheering now, uncertain and confused. Because the humans in the mining complex were watching from their barracks on screens that carried the fights to every corner of the facility. And they had just seen one of their own do something impossible. Throlek snarled and gestured to the gate handlers in a second. Vorik was released. Marcus killed that one too, though it cost him a wound across his ribs that painted the sand red with his blood. And when a third was released, he killed that one as well, fighting with a precision and determination that the spectators had never seen from a human before. But what the Watcher recorded, what she would remember for the rest of her existence, was not the killing. It was what happened after, when the final Vorik lay dead and the guards finally called an end to the spectacle. And Marcus stood alone in the center of the arena, surrounded by corpses and covered in blood, both his and theirs. He did not raise his arms in triumph or roar at the crowd or do any of the things the victors were supposed to do. Instead, he walked to the far side of the arena where the body of another prisoner lay, a man who had been killed in an earlier fight and left where he fell because dead prisoners did not merit cleanup. And Marcus knelt beside him and closed his eyes with gentle fingers and stayed there with his head bowed until the guards came to drag him away. The Watcher watched this, and something broke open inside her. Something that had been sealed for so long she had forgotten it was there. That night she broke protocol for the second time. She went to the medical ward where Marcus lay recovering from his wounds, attended by machines that did not care if he lived or died as long as they could report that treatment had been provided. And she stood beside his bed and watched him breathe and wondered what she was becoming. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw no surprise in his gaze, only exhaustion and pain and something deeper that might have been understanding. She asked him another question, the question that had been burning in her mind since she watched him kneel beside a dead man in an arena full of people who wanted him dead. She asked him why he had done that, why he had honored the fallen when he could barely stand, when no one would have blamed him for thinking only of himself. And Marcus looked at her with eyes that held 4,000 years of human history, every war and every peace and every moment of cruelty and kindness that had brought his species from caves to stars. And he said something that she would carry with her until the end of time. He said that maybe the kindness was not for the dead man at all. Maybe it was for everyone watching. Maybe it was to remind them that they were still human even when everything wanted them to forget. The Watcher left the medical ward and returned to her quarters, and for the first time since she had arrived on Nexer V, she did not record her observations in the official archive. Instead, she sat alone in the dark and thought about what she was going to do, because she knew now that she could not simply watch anymore. She had to act. They sent him as a prisoner to the stars. Thralkak was furious in the days following the arena. His plan had failed in the worst possible way. Instead of breaking the human spirit and reminding everyone of their place, he had turned Marcus Cole into a legend. The miners whispered his name in the tunnels, and the guards watched him with something that might have been fear. And the overseer knew that legends were dangerous things that needed to be destroyed before they could grow. He could not send Marcus to the arena again because the spectacle had been too public and too many eyes were now watching. But there were other ways to kill a man, quieter ways that did not require crowds or ceremony. And Thralkak began to plan the accident would happen in Shaft 9, where the rock was unstable and cave-ins were common enough that no one would ask questions. A controlled explosion that would bring down a section of tunnel with Marcus inside. And the official report would express appropriate regret about the loss of a productive worker. And that would be the end of the story. The Watcher learned of the plan through sources she would never reveal. Perhaps she had been observing longer than anyone knew. Perhaps her people had ways of gathering information that other species could not imagine. But she learned of it 3 days before it was supposed to happen, and she faced a choice that no Valori had faced in 10,000 years. Her people did not interfere. It was the foundation of everything they were. The sacred duty that gave their existence meaning. They watched and recorded and preserved the truth of history, but they did not change it. They did not pick sides or save lives or make themselves part of the stories they witnessed to. Interfere was to become something other than Valori, to abandon everything her species stood for, to break laws that had existed since before most. Civilizations were born. She thought about Marcus kneeling beside a dead man in an arena full of enemies. She thought about kindness. That was not a transaction but a choice, and she made her decision. The Council of Overseers met twice a week to discuss the administration of the mining complex, a gathering of the powerful where decisions were made and fates were sealed, and attendance was restricted to those with authority and those with information that the authority wanted to hear. And a Valori observer was always welcome because their presence added legitimacy to whatever happened within those walls. The Watcher entered the chamber in the middle of a discussion about production quotas, and every conversation stopped. Not because her presence was unusual, but because something about her was different. There was a light in her eyes that had not been there before. A purpose that radiated from her like heat from a star. He walked to the center of the room and spoke. 7 words that changed everything she said. I invoke the right of custodial witness. The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the room understood what those words meant, even if most of them had never expected to hear them spoken. The right was ancient and nearly forgotten. A provision in the oldest laws of the collective that allowed a Valori to claim a single individual as a subject of historical significance. The subject would be protected. Absolutely, because their story was not yet complete. To harm them was to harm the Valori's sacred duty. And to harm a Valori was to invite consequences that no species wanted to face. The Valori remembered everything. They held the official histories of 1,000 civilizations, and they could ensure that every crime and every atrocity committed by a species was recorded and shared and never forgotten. And the collective had too many secrets and too many enemies to risk that kind of exposure. Throlak rose from his seat with rage burning in his compound eyes and demanded to know what subject the Watcher was claiming. What prisoner could possibly be worthy of such unprecedented intervention? And she answered without hesitation. She said, "The human Marcus Cole is under my protection. His life is my record. His story is not finished." The chamber erupted in argument and objection and threats that everyone knew were empty. The law was clear, and the Valori did not make such declarations lightly. And by the time the council finally accepted what had happened, the sun had set and risen again, and Marcus Cole had become untouchable. They brought him before the council that afternoon, still wearing the clothes of a prisoner and still bearing the marks of the arena. And he stood beside the watcher and looked around the room at the beings who had controlled his fate, and saw something new in their eyes. Not respect exactly, but certainly not the casual contempt they had shown before, when the council finally dismissed them and the guards led Marcus away to quarters that were suddenly much more comfortable than his old barracks. He walked beside the watcher in silence for a long time before he finally spoke. He asked her what she had done, and she gave him an answer that was simpler than the truth, but contained enough of it to matter. She said, "I observed, and I made a choice." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The human who had refused to break, and the ancient being who had broken her own laws to save him. And something passed between them that neither of them had words for. He asked her why him? Why now? Why risk everything her people stood for to protect a single prisoner on a moon that no one cared about? The watcher considered the question and all the answers she could give. The philosophical explanations about the significance of individual lives. The historical arguments about the importance of preserving potential. The logical reasoning about patterns she had observed in human behavior that suggested this species was more important than the collective understood. But in the end, she gave him a different answer. She said that 4,000 years was a long time to watch and never be part of anything. A long time to record stories without being in any of them. A long time to observe kindness without ever feeling it directed toward hers. She said that when she watched him in the arena, when she saw him honor the dead when he could barely stand, something changed inside her that she did not fully understand. She said that maybe kindness was contagious, and she had finally caught it. Marcus listened to her words and nodded slowly, and then did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened since she arrived on Nexer V. Smiled. It was a small smile, tired and worn at the edges, but it was real and it was warm, and it was the first genuine expression of happiness she had seen on his face since she began watching him. And he said something that she would remember for the rest of her very long life. He said thank you. Not for saving him, but for seeing him. For looking past the chains and the number and the label of prisoner and seeing the person underneath. No one had done that in a very long time. Watcher felt something shift in her. Ancient hard, and she knew that whatever came next, whatever consequences her choice might bring, she had done the right thing. For the first time in 4,000 years, she had done something that mattered. They sent him as a prisoner to the stars. The PAVE declaration changed everything on Nexer 7 in ways that neither the Watcher nor Marcus could have predicted. Word spread through the mining complex like fire through dry grass. A human had been claimed by a Valori. A prisoner had become untouchable. And if one human could matter enough to be protected, then maybe they all mattered more than the collective wanted to admit. Marcus understood the power of what had happened, and he used it carefully. Not for himself, but for others, because his protection extended to those around him in ways that the law had never intended. Guards who might have beaten a prisoner thought twice when Marcus was nearby. Overseers who might have cut rations or extended shifts hesitated when they saw the Watcher following in his shadow. He did not demand better treatment or threaten consequences. He simply existed as a reminder that someone was watching, someone with a perfect memory and the power to make sure nothing was ever forgotten. And that was enough to change behavior in ways that years of resistance never could have. Other Valori began to arrive on Nexer 7, drawn by reports of their colleagues' unprecedented action. And they came with questions and concerns and curiosity about the species that had inspired such a dramatic break from tradition. And they watched the humans in the mines with new eyes, looking for whatever the Watcher had seen, looking for stories worth preserving. They found them everywhere. found stories of sacrifice and courage and love that survived in the darkest places. They found prisoners who shared their food with strangers and workers, who carried their injured companions and parents, who had been separated from their children and still hoped to see them again. And they recorded all of it because that was what Valori did. And for the first time, the humans of Nexus 7 were not just labor to be exploited, but subjects, worthy of witness. Journalists from other species followed the Valori, drawn by the unprecedented gathering of observers. And they asked questions that no one had asked before about where these prisoners came from and what crimes they had committed and whether the conditions on Nexus 7 met the standards that the collective claimed to uphold. The answers they found were damning. The scandal broke across 100 worlds within a year. Reports of abuse and exploitation and mortality rates that should have been impossible under collective law. And the authorities who had profited from human suffering found themselves facing investigations and sanctions. And the kind of attention they had always avoided. Thrill. Kak watched his power crumble with impotent fury. Everything he had built was being torn apart by a single human who should have died in the arena. And he knew that his own fate was sealed unless he could find a way to destroy the symbol that Marcus Cole had become. He could not touch Marcus directly. The Valori protection made that impossible. But if Marcus attacked him, if Marcus killed a collective official, then the protection would be void, and the humans would be revealed as the violent animals that Thrallkak had always claimed they were. Confrontation happened in a corridor near the administrative complex, a place where there were no witnesses except the ones Thrallkak had arranged. And the overseer came armed with a blade and a plan and the desperate certainty of someone with nothing left to lose. He attacked without warning, and Marcus responded with instincts that 15 years of soldiering had burned into his bones. And within seconds, Thrallkak was disarmed, and on his back with Marcus standing over him and the blade. Within easy reach, the Kethray looked up at the human with compound eyes full of hatred and something that might have been fear, and waited for the killing blow that would justify everything he had done. Marcus looked down at the creature that had tormented him and hundreds of others, the being responsible for so much suffering and death. And he felt the weight of every injustice pressing down on him, demanding revenge, demanding blood. He stepped back, he dropped the blade, and he said something that the Watcher, watching from a doorway that Thrallkak had not known about, would include in every version of the historical record she would ever create. He said, "You want me to be the monster you need. I will not give you Thathril." Kak was removed from his position the next day, and the investigation into his conduct would eventually lead to consequences that he had never imagined possible for someone of his species and rank. And the humans of Nexus 7 watched it all happen and understood that something fundamental had changed. The mining complex was closed within 5 years. The political pressure became too great, and the cost of maintaining operations exceeded the value of the minerals being extracted. And the prisoners were repatriated to Earth-controlled space under terms negotiated by diplomats, who suddenly cared very much about human welfare. Marcus Cole returned to Earth as something he had never expected to be, a symbol of everything humanity could achieve when they refused to surrender the things that made them human. And crowds gathered to see the man who had survived Nexus VN change the galaxy in the process. But he did not return alone. The Watcher came with him, having requested a permanent assignment as observer to the human homeworld. And if anyone noticed that she spent more time observing one human in particular than any of the others, they were polite enough not to mention it. The final entry in her record of the Nexus 7 affair became required reading across 100 civilizations, studied by students who wanted to understand how a single prisoner on a forgotten moon had sparked changes that reshuffled power across an entire sector of the galaxy. She wrote, "The humans have a saying that to witness is to care. I believed I understood this, but I was wrong. To witness is to become responsible. To truly see another being is to accept that their fate is now in some small way your own, she wrote. The human Marcus Cole taught me this without ever speaking the lesson aloud. He did not change the universe through strength alone, but through an insistence quiet and relentless and unbreakable that others mattered. That kindness was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all, she wrote. This, I have concluded, is why humanity will outlast us all. They do not simply survive, they make survival meaningful. They carry their humanity with them into the darkest places and refuse to let it go. And in doing so, they light fires that cannot be extinguished centuries past, and the story of Nexer 7 became legend. The tale of a soldier who would not fire on innocents and a prisoner who would not break, and an observer who learned to participate. And in every version across every species and every language, the ending was always the same. They sent him as a prisoner to the stars, and she became the reason no one dared touch him, and together they showed the universe what humanity could be when someone finally took the time to look in the archives of the Valori, preserved for eternity in perfect clarity. There is a final image from the day Marcus Cole left Nexer V, is walking toward a transport ship that will carry him home. And beside him walks a being made of starlight with eyes like galaxies. And they are not touching, but somehow they are connected in a way that transcends physical contact. Two souls that found each other in the darkest place imaginable and emerged into the light together, and he is smiling, and so is she. The end.